The drone and bells you're listening to are tuned to 432 Hertz instead of the more common 440 Hertz, which is the international standard for what's called concert pitch. The term concert pitch refers to the tuning of the A above middle C on the piano, which is the note that all other instruments in an ensemble tune themselves to. The difference between 440 and 432 Hertz is about a third of a semitone, or a third of the way between two notes on the piano. In recent years, bold claims have been made about significant differences between tuning to 432 Hz and 440. Tuning to 432 Hz is supposed to bring the listener into alignment with nature and the cosmos, whereas according to this theory, 440 Hz is unnatural and unhealthy. YouTube is filled with music videos that offer sound healing by virtue of their tuning to 432 Hz. And people are exhorted to repitch their existing musical libraries to bring them in line with the natural resonance of the universe. This sounds very compelling. Who doesn't want to be in harmony with the cosmos? And if all it takes is to tune your music down a third of a semitone, well, that would be the ultimate life hack. But is it true? Explanations are hard to come by, and they're usually based on hearsay. There are some experiments that purport to support the superiority of 432 Hz, but why were they testing it in the first place? Where did this hypothesis originate? Is it intuitive? Is it subjective? Or is there some objective authoritative source for the idea that concert pitch of 432 Hz is healthy and 440 is not? Sit back and listen to this 432 Hz soundscape while we investigate whether what you're hearing has any special powers. For centuries, there has been ongoing debate about what concert pitch should be, and it has varied wildly from place to place and person to person. The unit of measurement called Hertz has only been in use since 1935, and it's only since around that same time that oscilloscopes have allowed sound wave frequencies to be objectively depicted. Until then, tuning was entirely subjective, so it was very difficult to arrive at a standard value. The reason this has been an issue is because the trend toward higher tunings has put increasing strain on older instruments and the human voice. Up until early modern times, the human voice was considered the most fundamental musical instrument, and tunings tended to gravitate towards the human vocal range. But this began to change in the West as music became more complex and instrument-driven, and the piano supplanted the voice as the primary vehicle of musical thought and expression. An instrumental arms race led to the development of louder, brighter instruments that benefited from being tuned to a higher pitch, which became problematic for singers, particularly in the world of opera. The composer Giuseppe Verdi led the way in bringing the situation under control in the middle of the 19th century. And in 1939, a universal standard was finally agreed upon, which is that the A above middle C on the piano should be tuned to 440 Hz. This was a compromise solution that took into account higher and lower tunings that were being used at the time, and it was determined to be an easy measurement for electronic devices to record. Providing a standardized concert pitch made it easier for musicians, composers, and recording engineers around the world to collaborate in the production of music. It's not mandated by any law, and some orchestras continue to tune to a different pitch. But having a standard to refer to is considered to be an improvement over the confusion that was previously the norm. The idea that 432 Hz concert pitch has special qualities that go beyond music is entirely the work of an organization called the Schiller Institute, a think tank begun by political activist Lyndon LaRouche. The foundation of this idea was expressed in an article called The Foundations of Scientific Musical Tuning, written by Jonathan Tenenbaum, and published in Fidelio magazine in 1991. Fidelio magazine is simply the Schiller Institute's publication, so the article's appearance there doesn't constitute any sort of third-party validation. Tenenbaum's arguments are based entirely on the movement of the planets and their relation to something called synthetic geometry. And he only says that 432 Hz is the upper limit, not an absolute value. It can be lower, but not higher. The most important value is that of middle C, which must be 256 Hz, and he explains why in his article. But the most important part of this thesis, something that those who perpetuate the simplistic notion of 432 Hz supremacy don't understand, is a return to the use of just intonation instead of the equal temperament tuning that is predominant, particularly in the West. Even if you produce music with a bass tuning of 432 Hz, you're not in alignment with the planets unless you're also using just intonation. Just intonation defines tones as ratios of a bass note. Ratios, by their nature, can be expressed as fractions, such as 3/2, 4/5, a quarter, a half, and so forth, and for this reason are called rational numbers. If you start with middle C tuned to 256 Hz, the next C is double the frequency, or 512. Its ratio would be 2/1. That's called an octave, the most basic musical interval there is. And nobody has any arguments about that. You can build a scale on that C by multiplying it by a series of ratios that will give you the familiar intervals of notes that fill the space between octaves and which we use to compose melodies. So the second would be 9/8, the minor third 6/5, the major third 5/4, the fourth 4/3, the fifth is 3/2, the minor sixth 8/5, the major sixth 5/3, the minor seventh 9/5, and the major seventh of the scale would be 15/8. So the music you're hearing now is in just intonation. So it might sound a bit different than what you're used to, and that's due more to the intervals between the notes than the bass tuning itself. The C is tuned to 256 Hz, and the A is tuned to 432 Hz, and they are related to each other through a system called Pythagorean tuning, a form of just intonation. The drone that you're hearing includes both of those notes. Whether it's more in tune with the movement of the planets is debatable and less important than more prosaic questions such as, how does it sound? The medieval astronomer Johannes Kepler discovered that the orbits of the planets can also be described as ratios in the same way, as a sort of cosmic scale. And this is where the connection originates that Tenenbaum talks about in his article. So his proposal that we return to the simplest and most rational system of tuning, one that coincides with the periods of the planets, sounds quite reasonable, even compelling. It also brings up the question of why we moved away from it in the first place. The reason is simple. As music, particularly in the West, became more complex, it was found that just intonation doesn't produce pleasing results when constructing chords or changing keys. It works well for simpler music and is still quite common in the traditional music of India and Asia, where they tend to use 5-note scales rather than 7, and which doesn't involve a lot of harmonization. But it was found to be unsatisfactory for the sort of work that was being developed in Europe, and the result was the adoption of something called 12-tone equal temperament, in which the octave is divided into 12 even sections, each of which is a note. This results in every note being slightly wrong compared to the rational numbers, producing values that can't be expressed as a ratio and are therefore called irrational numbers. Not because they're crazy, but because they can't be reduced to a ratio. So for instance, the fifth in equal temperament is 1.498 times the bass note, rather than a nice clean 1.5. But ironically, the result is one of reason, harmony, and collaboration. It allows someone to play in any key on the piano and to play along with other instruments and have it all sound harmonious. It paved the way for musical innovation and the emergence of new genres such as jazz and rock. So the reason for choosing equal temperament, just like the reason for choosing 440 Hz as concert pitch, is musical. Ironically, it was adopted because just intonation was found to be disharmonious and irritating. The very things that 12-tone equal temperament music, tuned to 440 Hz, is now being accused of. It's not a conspiracy, something that was done in the shadows in order to subjugate people, as the Schiller Institute has argued. It's the result of centuries of debate and development. Which brings us back to an even more fundamental question. Even if there is some kind of coherence between the orbits of the planets and the ratios of just intonation, does that matter? Should we be looking at astronomy to tell us which frequencies and notes to use, or just doing what feels right and following our own creative impulses? Is it possible that real life is more complex than can be accounted for with simple fractions? It's a nice idea, but maybe it's an idealism that can be misguided. Is the reality of physical existence better reflected in the compromise of irrational numbers and 12-tone equal temperament tuning? Do you want to make music or do math? Does Tannenbaum's article actually have anything to do with music? I'm saying this as a natural idealist. I love seeing patterns, and I understand the lure of the grand unifying theory that you see in the study of sacred geometry. But I've also learned about the dark side of the idealism and how the ego likes to create a perfect world for itself. And once it does, it seeks to impose it on others. Which brings us back to Lyndon LaRouche and the Schiller Institute and their motives for promoting the 432 Hz Pythagorean tuning system. See, LaRouche's focus wasn't on music at all. Most of his efforts were directed at obtaining political power. The Schiller Institute was sort of his cultural arm. He's dead now, but it continues to carry on his legacy. He seemed more interested in controlling others than serving them. There's an element to his story of the comic book villain who wants to rule the world. That's why he was interested in controlling what people would listen to. The Schiller Institute and LaRouche's other organizations have often been accused of being cults, because of their treatment of members and their attempts to impose their beliefs on society in general, often through violence. The reason they promote their program of tuning is that they are avowedly anti-modern, and they want to revert to a time hundreds of years ago when music was much simpler and based on the human voice. Tannenbaum says so in his article. The Schiller Institute tried to have their program codified into law in Italy. They have characterized those who disagree with them as satanic. They have equated 440 Hz tuning with the Nazis, something that its current proponents repeat uncritically. So when people extol the virtues of 432 Hz tuning without investigating its foundations, they have unwittingly been brainwashed by the cultish Schiller Institute. And that's the disturbing thing about this whole 432 hoax. How people have embraced it based purely on hearsay and then perpetuated it to the point where it's almost become mainstream, an accepted alternative based on completely specious reasoning that isn't even being properly implemented. And yet, people are debating the relative merits of 440 versus 432 as if there is some substance to it. There's no historical, musical, or scientific basis for the superiority of 432 Hz tuning. Having dealt with the facts, I will now offer my opinions on what I think is really going on with this issue. The real problem isn't the Schiller Institute. Few people know about it, and who cares what it says anyway? It isn't even the YouTubers who churn out their 432 Hz ambient masterpieces. They're just giving the people what they want. And what they want is long, soothing soundscapes in 432 Hz. No, the root problem is people's desire for simple solutions. A quick fix. For someone to tell them what to think so they don't have to think for themselves. They've been told that 432 Hz will solve all their problems, and they want that to be true. That's what leads people to join cults like Lyndon LaRouche's organization in the first place. Beyond not having to think for yourself, one of the benefits of being a member of a cult is the notion that you're a member of an elite group with special knowledge. And sure enough, you see this idea being pursued by people who blithely label themselves as conscious and awakened. And yet, they're doing something without knowing the reason for it, which is the very definition of unconscious. I've seen references to this sort of stuff as conscious music, which I find extremely arrogant. It's all part of an image, a tribal identity. Listening to 432 Hz music is the secret handshake of that particular tribe, evidence of their elevated level of consciousness. No further proof required. And just think, they didn't have to do anything. All those monks who spent all that time contemplating the nature of reality, all they had to do was listen to the right music. I've seen comments on these YouTube videos where people swear that 432 Hz music sounds completely different, where in reality the only difference is that it's pitched a third of a semitone lower. If you prefer that and you can actually tell the difference, well, that's fine, but as we've seen, it doesn't actually mean anything else, particularly if it's not tuned with just intonation. What they're doing is called rationalization, which is completely different from actual reasoning. They're looking for a conscious explanation for an unconscious decision. The reason they're listening to 432 Hz music in the first place is because they've been told to, and because others are doing it. And they're just going along with the crowd. The placebo effect could also be in play. They've been told that they're listening to special healing music and they want to believe it and make it true. Which is not to say that the music may not have beneficial properties, but it's not dependent on special esoteric factors that the uninitiated wouldn't appreciate. Maybe listening to relaxing music just has a relaxing effect. If the 432 hypothesis was true, then you could make any kind of music with that tuning, and it would have the same effect. Yet you only see it being used for ambient music. So think about it. Do you want to live in a reality where only people with special knowledge can access, let's call it salvation? I don't have the capacity to understand most of what's in that article by Tannenbaum, and that puts me at a disadvantage. Does that mean I can't commune with the cosmos properly unless he, the expert, tells me how to do it? What frequencies and tunings to use? Does that make my music and so much other music wrong? The Schiller Institute would say, yes, it does. And yes, they do want us all to live in a reality like that. And they'll tell us what to think and do. And there are a lot of people who want that as well. Who want a guru or a priest or a strongman or a father figure or an expert to take away the uncertainty of living in the world and the need to take responsibility for yourself in the midst of it. To be your own damn guru. You don't even need any technical knowledge to test the validity of the 432 Hz hypothesis. Just examine your own experience and that of people in general. Does listening to music make you feel good or bad? Do people like to listen to music? And if so, why? Now take into account that no matter what genre people are listening to, it's probably tuned to 440 Hz. Which, according to the proponents of 432 Hz tuning, is supposed to be bad for you. It's supposed to dehumanize you and make you miserable and disconnected from the cosmos. It's also going to be tuned to 12-tone equal temperament, which is all irrational numbers, except for the octaves, and therefore supposedly disharmonious and chaotic. And yet, in spite of that, people seem to actually like listening to music. All sorts of music, all the time. It makes them feel good. It also makes them feel sad, angry, sexy, and all sorts of things. It connects them to themselves, each other, and the artists who create it. It can even create feelings of rapture, bliss, and divine connection. The idea that music tuned to 440 Hz is detrimental is so obviously false that it's bizarre that the idea is taken seriously at all. It's a classic example of gaslighting, and another example of the brainwashing that perpetuates this idea. So who are you going to trust? Some self-proclaimed expert, or some hearsay, or your own damn ears? There is another theory that is sometimes cited as a reason to tune music in this way. It's based on the Schumann resonances, an energy field produced by the Earth that was discovered in the mid-20th century. According to this theory, the base frequency of these resonances is 8 Hertz, which has been referred to as the Earth's heartbeat. If you double that, which translates into going up an octave, it's 16, and if you continue the process, you wind up at 256, which is the value that the Schiller Institute demands middle C be tuned to, for reasons that are related to the planetary orbits. Now this is literally a more down-to-earth basis, and if you place that value in a Pythagorean tuning, then you end up with your A above the middle C being 432 Hertz. This is interesting, although maybe nothing more than that, because the Schumann resonances are electromagnetic energy, not sound waves. And it's a stretch to say that the same numbers mean the same things in different spheres, which operate according to different laws. I've never seen any reference to octaves in the electromagnetic realm, so applying the concept to the Schumann resonances may be meaningless. And by the way, the base frequency isn't exactly 8 Hertz anyway, it's 7.83. So that theory's out the window. Same goes for planetary orbits and sounds. It's like saying that this toaster and that car should work the same because they're the same color. It's like taking a metaphor literally. And it brings up the same issues we've already discussed about looking for external validation and guidance for the musical experience. I'm not one of those people who self-identifies as a skeptic and casually dismisses anything that doesn't conform to a narrow band of thinking as pseudoscience. In fact, I believe a lot of things that a lot of people would call pseudoscience or conspiracy theory. But these applications of numbers from one discipline to another might actually qualify as pseudo or fake science. It's comparable to how the word quantum has been appropriated by a certain philosophical tendency in a way that has no relation to its actual meaning in the actual science of quantum physics, and has become nothing more than a generic superlative. Same with the word Zen, which to a lot of people means relaxed, which real Zen is certainly not. It's all part of an attempt to apply a thin veneer of science or spirituality without actually doing the work of science or spiritual practice. The 432 Hz music videos are similar to other long-form videos that are comprised of soothing music or environmental sounds like rain falling and water flowing and so forth. People like to have them on in the background, particularly as sleep aids, so it's possible that rather than becoming conscious, a lot of people are looking for help in becoming unconscious. Finally, if you've had any exposure to this sort of music, you've probably also encountered something called the solfeggio tones, a specific set of frequencies that are supposed to have the same sort of healing benefits as tuning to 432 Hz. The solfeggio tones warrant a discussion of their own, so for now I'll just say that another sign that people are perpetuating this idea without understanding it is that 432 is often referred to as a solfeggio tone, which it is not. 417 and 285 Hz are solfeggio tones, not 432 or 256. So there seems to be some confusion about which frequencies the universe actually vibrates at. And now people have decided that the sort of repeating numbers that often show up as synchronicities would make good healing frequencies as well. So you're starting to see videos with music tuned to 111, 222, 333 Hertz, and so forth. You might also see them with a runtime of something like 11 hours, 11 minutes, and 11 seconds. As if, like an actual synchronicity, it just emerged out of the underlying symmetry of the universe, rather than being a blatant attempt to manipulate people's attention. You can even find videos with music that contains one of each: a synchronicity frequency, 432 Hertz, and a solfeggio tone. The purveyors of this nonsense are exposing themselves as frauds, and it's up to listeners now to stop listening and start using their minds to actually listen to music, like we used to do. Remember music? So if you don't mind, I'd like to end on a positive note and talk about actual music, where it comes from, how it's made, and what it means. When I started investigating these ideas, I actually assumed they were true. I just wanted to understand them. I get the appeal of sacred geometry and so forth. However, that's not where music actually comes from. It comes from within, guided by our intuition and directed by the forms we've been exposed to. It's not an intellectual exercise at all. It's certainly not an exercise in math or cosmology. Steeping yourself in sacred geometry or even music theory doesn't necessarily qualify you to make music, at least not good music. It's more likely to be boring and pretentious. And if you feel the need to label your music by its tuning, then I think you're doing it wrong. And here's the dirty little secret about those idealistic musical systems of perfect symmetry. They're not ideal, they're not perfect, and they're not symmetrical. In fact, Pythagorean tuning has a glaring fault called the Pythagorean comma, which means that it's not even in harmony with itself. There's a gap, a horrible sounding gap. It's incomplete. So how can it put us in tune with the cosmos when it can't even get its own act together? It's important to note that this flaw resides in the math itself. It's not an error in execution. It's a feature, not a bug. So what does this lack of perfection in the ideal realm mean? Well, maybe this incompleteness is what drives the creative process forward, not just in the creation of music, but the creation of the world itself. I think the biggest error in all of this is trying to use music, science, math, cosmology, and thought itself to go backwards to some pristine ideal state before everything got complicated, before there was any need for music, science, math, and thought. A time of simplicity and harmony, but also stasis. People equate this with being in sync with nature, whereas if you look at nature itself, you see that it is constantly driving towards greater, not less complexity. Nature is creatively restless, constantly coming up with new forms. That's how it resolves its internal tensions, its incompleteness. This is borne out in chaos theory and general systems theory. It's how we stay ahead of the second law of thermodynamics and avoid falling into a state of heat death. The universe doesn't want you to stay in a constant state of unity and completion, if that's even possible. It wants you to get out there and experience the world and the duality and the complexity of it and be inspired by it. Integrate the tensions in your world and transform them into something higher that's maybe never existed before. When it comes to the concept of sound healing, there seems to be a tendency to treat it as an end in itself, instead of asking, what's the purpose of the healing? Once you've been healed, what are you going to do with your health? There's no going back to the womb, there's only going forward towards greater maturity and mastery. There is a higher level of simplicity that lies on the other side of complexity, and that's something worth striving for. But it's forwards, not backwards. And this is just my opinion, but I find something very infantile about sound bath and sound healing culture. Let's go back to that idea of conscious music. Does such a thing exist? Is all music conscious? No, a lot of times we listen habitually, unconsciously, oftentimes to drown out the contents of consciousness. We often hear music, but we don't really listen to it. Even when people are listening to what they consider to be conscious music, they can simply be playing a role, and it's the soundtrack to the movie they're starring in. If I had to point to an example of conscious music, I'd say consider the work of John Cage. Not even the work itself and what it sounds like, not its form, but the fact that it's built on a foundation of curiosity. As much as possible, he looked for ways to get the ego out of the way so music could emerge in its purest form without preconceptions. There's a childlike innocence and simplicity to his method which is very honest and genuine. It is to some extent an expression of his own Zen practice and his appreciation of the magic of chance processes, the sort of real synchronicities that can happen when we get out of the way. You could even argue that his piece entitled 433 is the most conscious piece of music ever composed. It's literally nothing but consciousness. You can find performances of it on YouTube. Listening consciously means actually using your mind, not just going along with what the collective has labeled as such. And it turns out there's a lot to sink your mental teeth into once you do. Different scales and modes and lots of different tunings that go beyond the 12-tone convention, generally referred to as microtunings. And who says music has to be tuned in the first place? There's a whole world of atonal music out there. And the whole concept of found sound, which is that music could be found in any sound at all. It's in the ear of the beholder. Being curious about the possibilities of the world and open to new experiences is way more natural than analytically judging what's good and bad and seeking to control the flow of experience. That's egocentric and not in harmony with the cosmos. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more music in just intonation, you might want to start with the work of the composer Lamont Young and his piece, The Well-Tuned Piano. If you're still listening, then you're probably someone who'd like the rest of the stuff I do, so you should totally like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment. Cheers.